Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. With the recent news surrounding the softening of the art market and gallery closures, we thought in this week's episode we'd look into the job market within the art world. And there's no better guest than Rachel Johnston, managing partner at Sophie Macpherson, the leading talent recruiting firm within the art world. We chat with Rachel about trends within the job space. She offers advice for candidates. We dive into the recent survey they did with the Toledo Museum of Art, focusing on why institutions should be looking to the commercial art world for potential hires. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. This week's episode is joined by Rachel Johnston, managing partner at Sophie Macpherson, the art world talent specialist that really have been helping businesses recruit and retain talents. And they've been doing it really for a long time since I've been in the art world and even beforehand. Rachel's kind enough to join us to chat about a variety of aspects relating to the art world and the job market within that. Rachel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So I think you have a really unique vantage point on hiring really across the art world. With the art market softening, we of course have had some gallery closures. I'm curious to start off, how would you describe the job market climate right now?
Yeah, it's a question I'm getting a lot. Prudent and strategic are basically the words that I've been using this year. Businesses are really kind of fortifying what works and they're not taking so many risks, but hiring is happening. And I think there's a bit of a misconception there. It was slower last year, sure, but hiring is happening this year, but it's deliberate. It's carefully thought through. There's a clear rationale for the hire. There's demonstrable value to the hire. So it's just very thoughtful and considered is the sort of general mood. Market pressures and leaner teams are exposing weaknesses in organizations. That's very true. And we're seeing that our clients are addressing those weaknesses through sort of deeper organizational work to kind of strengthen their existing teams, but then also plug any gaps via any kind of more strategic new hires. So there is a sort of pipeline of new roles kind of coming up as a result of that sort of work that people are kind of recognizing that they need to do in this different landscape. So I think that's really promising, actually. On the candidate side, there's a few things that we're noticing candidates really paying attention to, particularly at a senior level at the moment, and that's sort of security, fulfillment, and longevity in terms of, can they see themselves staying somewhere long term, and is there a real opportunity to kind of contribute? We're finding that a lot of these candidates are, they really want to understand the strategic direction, whether there'll be a seat at the table for them if they're a senior person, what the stability of that organization has been like over this kind of more turbulent time, and the potential for kind of long-term, they want to see that there's something they can dig into kind of longer term and make a kind of real difference. So I'd say the candidate approach is kind of it's like less transactional than perhaps it used to be, more holistic, not just about salary. That's still important, but a kind of broader conversation. And the other thing is, we're seeing this time and time again, and this is challenging, I think, for employers in this market where budgets are tighter, but candidates, if they're going to make the move, they want to see that they're going to have the tools, the resources, and the runway to actually succeed and be supported through a kind of reasonable settling in period. So that's where there's been a little bit of disparity in the last couple of years, because understandably employers sort of feel like if they're going to invest in a senior hire, it needs to be proven within a certain period of time. And that's true to an extent, but it takes some time. So people really want to see that there's a reasonable understanding of kind of how that works. So basically, in conclusion, there's more scrutiny, and that's on both sides of the equation, really.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And yeah, and you touched on this a bit, but given that climate, I guess, how are you maybe advising candidates who are looking for work right now, some of whom may have come from galleries or other businesses that have either closed or restructured recently?
Yeah, I mean, the main bit of advice is just keep an open mind, really. Don't automatically seek the closest equivalent to the previous role that you had. Think instead about how your experience kind of might translate. Sounds obvious, but I think people get quite literal about kind of job titles and really look beyond those titles. There is not a shared language in the art world for titles, as we all know. And, that you could have two titles in two different organizations and they could mean quite different things and be quite different levels of seniority in reality. So, a seemingly lesser opportunity and title could actually represent a kind of greater development opportunity for you and your kind of career progression. So keeping that open mind, I think, is super important. Get under the bonnet of the role itself as opposed to just making assumptions on title. And then, the other big thing that I'm sort of, me and my team are kind of advising candidates is bring energy, be informed, do your research, personalize your approach, really. You've got to show that you're engaged. I think employers can tell if this is your like fifth first round interview in 1 week. If there's a sort of fatigue, it's sort of obvious. And, we're seeing that employers are really valuing people that are bringing a level of energy and who will think creatively and who will approach things a little bit differently and hustle, frankly, in this market rather than feeling kind of more despondent by the challenges that the market's thrown at us. Sort of using that to showing that you can use that to kind of rethink things, I think is starting to become more valuable. So that is, I think, important. And then, on the kind of restructure redundancy side of things, I think one thing that's really important to say, and I'm saying this because we get a lot of anxiety from candidates that have been made redundant or been sort of victim to a restructure. They are really worried about how that reflects on them. But the reality is that there's an understanding that this is kind of happening or has happened with multiple sort of businesses in the industry in the last kind of 2 years. And it's not a reflection on the candidate. And there is that understanding there. So don't dwell on that too much and definitely lead with transparency around the reasons for your exit. I don't think it serves anyone to try and kind of avoid that topic. It's better just to be very practical about it, bench it, and then really sort of focus on what you've achieved, learned, want to do next, all of those kind of more meaty things that you really want to be focusing the interview process on. And then on a kind of, bit more of a boring practical level, have your materials up to date, have clear records of your performance and notable achievements. And on your materials, don't make, I see this so many times where a CV basically just reads as a job description. That's not the point of a CV. Say what you've done as opposed to what your job description dictates and kind of what you have achieved. So that's another kind of piece of advice that is quite obvious. But I think, the amount of times I talk to someone who is ready to leave and they haven't really thought deeply about these things. So I think it's worth taking the time to kind of do that.
Yeah, no, it's really great advice. And so I want to ask you about something that I found really interesting and is a bit more positive, really, which is about the survey that you did recently with the Toledo Museum of Art. Tell us a little bit more about that, what prompted it, because I think actually it was when I was reading about it, it allowed me really to think outside the box. I think that's what that did. And I think maybe even candidates, people working in the art world, people looking for work in the art world should be thinking outside the box, and maybe museums doing the same.
Totally. Yeah, no. And it's such an interesting topic. I mean, it came about because in our sort of 20 plus year history, we've observed that there are significant synergies between, the commercial and the museum worlds. And I'm quite often talking to quite senior candidates in the industry, and I had noticed a sort of pattern actually of sort of being open to roles outside of the commercial space, but not really knowing kind of how to access it, feeling like there was actually kind of a bit of a block there. And then, in the background, museums have become increasingly complex organizations. We all know that. And they're requiring an ever more varied skill set to really kind of thrive, survive, all of those things. That's important at this juncture. So we became really curious to explore, is there a cross-pollination of talent beyond the kind of few and far between examples that we've seen? And then we were introduced by a sort of very good friend to SML and a mutual contact to the Toledo Art Museum. And of course, Toledo are celebrated for their kind of quite pioneering approach. I know you had Adam Levine, their director CEO, on the podcast recently as well. And really, when we were introduced to him, it was very obviously the ideal partner with whom to kind of launch this project, because his, he is, as you know, firmly rooted in the museum world, but he's really interested in rethinking models and challenging assumptions. And he's just a really kind of dynamic, forward-thinking person. So we were really lucky to be introduced to him and to Toledo. And so it sort of happened that way. And then the survey itself, for those listeners that haven't sort of seen this article and survey response, but it tested assumptions that our agency had basically been observing more anecdotally, and its findings did reinforce what we'd been hearing. I think there were 400 respondents, and nearly 3/4 of them were open to museum work. And 68% of that 400 were at a notably senior level as well. So this is an appetite. There are some really kind of qualified people with an appetite to kind of move into this space. And, when asked the motivation for wanting to make that kind of move at this juncture, it's not really about, it's not a sort of, again, it's not a transactional approach. It's about doing more mission-driven work, or working with historical collections, or public access to art and culture. It's those sorts of reasons that are motivating people. So it kind of proved what our hunch was, really, that actually there is this appetite. And then we got to thinking with Adam and through the survey of like, okay, well, how do you actually kind of bridge that gap in theory? So yeah, it was an interesting project.
Yeah, and it got me sort of thinking and wondering, how siloed do you think the commercial and the museum worlds really are, and why should museums be looking at individuals from the commercial space? What do you think these candidates might bring to the table that could potentially be missing from certain museum settings?
Yeah, no, it's a really valid question. I mean, I would actually say, in answer to the part of your question about how siloed this is, almost more siloed in terms of career paths and recruitment than in actual skill set or capability, like when you really drill down on it. So when you look beneath titles and terminology, which do vary, sector to sector, there is significant overlap and sort of a shared skill set. So yes, some roles absolutely require specialist and scholarly knowledge and experience cultivated purely in the context of museums. No one's contesting that. That's going to be important forever. But museums are increasingly complex organizations, as I said, and they would benefit from a more varied skill set, or could benefit from a more varied skill set. So I think the divide is actually, it's more of perception than of capability in a way. And I should say, none of this was aimed at wanting to make museums more commercial. It's more just about recognizing useful skills developed in commercial environments that could translate. There's a level of commercial awareness perhaps that could be useful to navigate fundraising, retail partnerships, membership, earned income, all of those sorts of things. And salespeople working with clients in the kind of commercial space, well, they could very naturally translate to working with donors in the context of a museum, for example. So there's a lot more synergy than people give credit for, and that's partly due to a kind of a lack of shared language, I think. I think the other important thing, and why I think it's worth considering a skill set from more of the kind of commercial space, is it's different perspectives. And regardless of whether you're a museum or any organization, bringing people together with different backgrounds, it's only going to challenge assumptions and then reduce the kind of groupthink, as it were. So adding a perspective is sort of, we see it as a valuable thing, essentially. And we're not saying commercial experience is automatically better than non-commercial experience. We're saying it's different. And is that helpful, basically? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And yeah, I'm curious if maybe the survey gets more museums contemplating hiring people from outside of the nonprofit space. I think it's going to be really interesting to track and see if that changes, if we see some changes over the next few years, especially with the commercial market kind of suffering or softening at least. So to close out, I have to ask you a question about AI. It's obviously playing a role in so many different industries in a variety of ways. I'm curious, to what extent do you think it's playing a role in the art world right now, and really in particular in the hiring practice? Do you feel like employees are asking candidates if they know how to use AI, or is the art world perhaps not there yet?
I think it's coming up more, but I'm not sure it's there yet. So we're seeing definitely a kind of appetite for fluency and comfort working with, emerging technologies or taking different approaches to things to kind of streamline and save time. But that's not always framed as AI experience, although ultimately the tool that could kind of, I guess, automate to alleviate could be, the use of AI on a very kind of basic level. And I think that's how the art world will start. It will be more about how do you, and when we're seeing this actually reflected in a kind of rising demand for like CTO type positions in organizations. And I think, it's really about how do you give your employees some time back to spend on things that really matter on a human level. And this industry, of course, that's so important. That's such a big part of what people are doing. So I think the art world's perspective on it, or at least from the conversations that I've had with various clients, it's really about freeing people up to do what is most valuable and like put their energy in the right places essentially. So there's definitely this sort of like automating to alleviate kind of factor. And I think this is one area that businesses will be investing in to become kind of leaner, meaner, more efficient, all the things. It kind of circles back to my first answer actually around kind of this organizational, like thinking deeply around kind of organizational structure, and into that comes technology really, and investment into technology. So we're seeing it a little bit, but it's fledgling, I would say, at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I wonder if maybe we might even see it first with smaller galleries where maybe there's less bureaucracy, where people need to wear many hats. Maybe, if you have certain AI skills, maybe a smaller gallery or a smaller type business, it might be more attractive to them because you can, as I said, do many tasks, and you can, and of course for a smaller gallery or a smaller company, that may be more valuable, at least initially.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's also the clients that I'm talking to, they're open to someone sort of learning that on the job in a way at the moment. I mean, that will change as the more AI sort of settles in, I suppose. But in the sort of like, we're in the early few years of it really being adopted kind of in the workplace, let's say. And I think they're really wanting to see that there is a kind of openness, like you say, to kind of streamline and use it to benefit the business. So I think it's about like, I think there's more of a desire for candidates who are not overly reliant on traditional ways of working and who are not resistant to change, but rather thinking like, oh, what could we do? And like, what is the potential here? And that extends across the board beyond AI. Honestly, I think that attitude is kind of what this market is looking for in its talent. That's because I think the quote last year, you probably heard this, but in 2025, lots of people were saying we're working, twice as hard for half the result or whatever. And I don't think it feels that way anymore. But if you can save people time, then I think it's only kind of going to be a kind of positive thing. So yeah, I think we'll see more of it.
Definitely. Rachel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and updating us on different trends and what's going on exactly in the job market within the art world. And if our listeners want to learn more about Sophie Macpherson, what are the ways they can do that and even potentially engage with you for your services?
Yes. Well, you can call or email or find us via kind of Instagram or LinkedIn as well. Our website is sophiemacpherson.com. So you can find us there, and all the various kind of services are signposted. But yeah, please reach out on whatever platform is kind of suitable for you, and we'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much, Adam, for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again. We appreciate it.
Of course, pleasure. Speak soon.